Yes, no problem. I guess I'm going to do a press with everybody else.
Sally, can I ask you a question, please?
Yeah, of course you can. What's your question?
Just a couple of things. First of all, Rebecca is based in Nairobi, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and here's Sabrina, so I can ask her.
Sabina.
Sabina. Sabrina, no R. And I think that I can pronounce your surname right. So Sabina Chofu.
That's perfect.
Is it? It's okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay.
Yes.
And are you sitting there in London or are you in Brussels?
I'm in Brussels.
You're in Brussels.
We're a pretty international panel, it has to be said.
Yeah. And so, Sabina, are you in Brussels? Would you flip between the two when flitting is possible?
Well, in normal times, I live on the Eurostar in between London and Brussels, but
Exactly.
in current times, stuck in Brussels.
Now I can.
Yeah. I'm going to just.
Now we're Rico. Over there.
You can start.
Is the video completed? Hello, I'm Jane Drake Brockman. I'm the founding director of the Australian Services Roundtable, which is the peak industry body for the services sector in Australia. And I'm delighted to moderate this first session in the digital trade stream, designed for the general public and organised by two services industry stakeholders, EY and TechUK. And we have a very interesting question to discuss, the topic, which might seem surprising to some of you, but for those of us in the services industries themselves, it's a question that we ask ourselves all day, every day. Is digital trade just services trade? Or if it isn't, plus or minus, is digital trade services trade? And we have a very interesting panel to discuss the topic. So first we have Sally Jones, who is a partner from EY in London. She leads the trade strategy and Brexit team. So Sally is a professional services provider, and she is the go-to person in London for multiple companies across a whole variety of industries, whether they're Fortune 500 or Financial Times, Stock Exchange, Top 100 listed, or trade associations, in terms of providing trade policy advice, whether it's global or specifically to do with EU, UK. We have Rebecca Fisher-Lamb. For the last handful of years, Rebecca was the key person in the UK Department of International Trade working on trade and services. And for that last cluster of years, focusing not only on the WTO, but also on the post-Brexit trade policy. And she now has a very different remit, sitting there in Nairobi with a Pan-African mandate. She's the UK's Deputy Commissioner for Trade for Africa. And Sabina Chofu, who is the trade policy lead for TechUK. And she comes to that position from a decade of experience working as an advisor in the European Parliament on tech-related legislation. So it's a great deal of expertise at industry level, all of them, in a sense, working at the coalface of interacting on a daily basis with companies. And I'd just like to add that in addition to the usual mix of economics and trade law, we have in this panel a solid dose of science. So Sally is an astronomer and an astrophysicist, and Sabina is fitting in a PhD on artificial intelligence in the margin. So an interesting collection of speakers. And I'm going to turn first to Sally. So we hear all the time, Sally, that new digital technologies and the fourth industrial revolution is all about changes in corporate business models. And I want to ask you, what do you see in terms of how those business models are changing also for international trade? How is digitalization actually changing the way companies conduct trade?
Thank you very much, Jane. It's a total pleasure to be here, especially with an all-female panel. That makes me incredibly proud. I guess the first point I would make is that companies don't think about trade in the same way that we do. So putting the corporate perspective forward, there's no company that thinks to itself, I wonder if I ought to be changing my business model to reflect digital and services trade aligning. As far as companies are concerned, every single company views itself as unique and views what it does as just the thing it does rather than an aspect of or example of trade. They don't share our language around trade. They certainly don't have the technical capabilities that governments and professional bodies such as TechUK have with trade. And oftentimes in our experience, they're not actually aware on any conscious level of what is stopping them or encouraging them to trade. They're not aware of the levers to which they're responding. Certainly in my experience with Brexit and UK companies, and I accept that UK companies may be a slight oddity in many ways because of the decisions that have been made in the UK government over the past 4 years since the referendum. But in my experience of UK companies, if you pop into a meeting with them and ask them what the barriers to trade are that they're currently trying to grapple with, they'll look at you as if you're crazy. And they won't even realise that there are barriers there. They simply will not have crossed their mind that this is anything other than the way that they've always done things. So in some ways, this question about whether digitalisation has changed how companies trade is, from a corporate perspective, a really meaningless question. Now, of course, that means that there are many gains to be made from digitalisation, particularly around lower margin services trade. And in order for companies to take a benefit of those, they have to up their game away from their kind of almost unquestioning viewpoint that this is simply how things work. Now that means that governments have a role to play. For example, by making sure that their business engagement teams act as simultaneous translators between the trade questions we want answered and the questions that get put to companies. But also companies need to up their game. So one of the questions they need to ask themselves is, why don't we have somebody within our business that's responsible for trade, whether it's services trade or digital trade or anything else, in the same way that we have people responsible for finance or responsible for tax or any other aspects of our business. So from a corporate perspective, if we say everything is converging, goods and services and digital, and that COVID has accelerated this, although we probably intuitively accept that to be true, and we can look at anecdata from our corporate clients, that's not how they would see it. Now, what companies do know about is the regulations that apply to them, whether it's friction on payments or a need for a local subsidiary in order to have proper access to the infrastructure or to meet digital localization requirements, or taxation requirements, or whether there's something like the EU's GDPR that's impacting on their ability to share data. They know about that. They know about regulation. And a handful of observations there. So the first is, and people laugh when I say this, but it is true, companies want to comply with regulations. Not one of my client companies has any desire other to be compliant with the regulations that are put to them. They might not like those regulations. They might find them clunky and difficult, but they certainly want to comply. They certainly don't want to be the corporate which is on the front page of the newspapers for having messed up a data flow issue or a GDPR concern or whatever it might be. So that's observation number one. Observation number two is that services have a well-recognised and understood framework for regulation in most of the regulated subsectors, but that digital has not caught up with that. So what we are typically seeing is a piecemeal range of regulation from around the globe, which is in some instances impossible for a company to comply with all possible regulations because they are mutually contradictory. And I know Sabina's going to cover regulation in a bit more detail in her section, so I won't go much further, but I would call out right now and ask participants to so the audience to start thinking in terms of, what would a common framework for digital regulation need to look like, and what would its main building blocks be? Because until we get that common framework, we're not going to be able to unlock all of the benefits that we're looking to unlock from digital trade. I think that the third point I wanted to make on regulation is that companies need it to be outcomes focused rather than process focused and proportionate. So companies recognize that there are bad actors out there that wish to exploit data breaches or the dark web or whatever it might be. And they recognize that those threats need to be countered, but the regulation that does that needs to be appropriate and easy to implement for corporates so that they can comply as they wish. Which leads me on to my final question in my part of the presentation, which is that has some digital regulation gone too far? And I'm almost being provocative in saying that. But when I look at the sheer weight of effort that my companies have put in order to comply with the European General Data Protection Regulation, it is enormous. Whole new careers have been forged on GDPR compliance. There is an entire absence of trust between regulators, between the EU and outside of the EU. It's like a bad relationship. Trust would be good, but control is better. And until we get better coordination and cooperation between regulators, we will never achieve that common framework that companies are crying out for in order to ensure that digital and services trade and the benefits of their ever closer alignment are realised. I appreciate there's a lot of concepts I've just dumped on you right there. I'm going to stop now and hand back to Jane.
Thank you, Sally. Well, you make a very important point, reminding us that it is businesses that trade. I mean, governments might facilitate it or get in the way, but it's the companies that are trading, and they tend not to use the trade terminology that is used in Geneva. And it's very important to have someone who can translate between the policy community and the corporate world. So we might come back to some of those issues, Sally. I'm going to ask Rebecca a question, if I may, because it seems to me you've had a very interesting shift in your move to Nairobi, and we hear a lot about things which need to be done. One, to adjust aid for trade, for example, to take account of digitalization. We hear a lot about the need for ICT infrastructure or digital skills training. But I wonder, now that you're there on the ground and you're experiencing the extent to which African nations are or are not included and playing in this new world, I'd like to ask you, what are the sort of policy approaches that you think might be important for African nations and for other countries to ensure that Africa can benefit from the productivity gains and the standard of living increases that are going to come from really entering the digital age? So, Rebecca, it's a policy question really for you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for having me. And as you say, this is an agenda that I'm really personally very passionate about. It was a big part of my last role leading on services negotiations for the UK government, and I've definitely taken it across to Africa. And my role in Africa as Her Majesty's Deputy Trade Commissioner for the UK government is very much focused on trade policy, and particularly looking at some of those regulatory barriers, behind the border barriers that enable trade. So services and digital is really at the heart of it. I feel like I can't talk about how to spread the benefits of digital trade more inclusively across Africa without just raising the point that it's such a vast and it's such a diverse continent. The stage of development for each country is different across Africa, and by Africa we also include North Africa in that. The focus of each market, the key sectors, the drivers behind public policy making are really different. For a landlocked country that finds the challenges and difficulties and costs of securing adequate ICT infrastructure to facilitate their digital trade needs is really different to other countries that have more access. And obviously their approach to trade policy really, really varies. And a lot of agreements for African countries are focused still on goods, which obviously are highly enabled by services, but a lot of the trade agreements are covering more of the goods side than they are the services side. And in this context, it feels like a bit of a sort of false question, really, to consider whether digital trade and services trade are increasingly becoming the same, or if a good as a service and not a good, because exactly as Sally says, from a company perspective, they don't break it down, but also from an African policymaker or regulator's perspective, they're not thinking, right, which bucket does this sit in, or will it fall in, and which definition should I be using? They're thinking, I have a really big policy problem here. How do I solve it, and how do I resolve it? And whether we think it's right or wrong, often trade policy isn't the first primary driver, particularly when you're looking at some of the real big challenges that these countries are facing. And obviously, I can't talk about the trade challenges they're facing without mentioning the economic hit of COVID, which, to be honest, on this continent at least, feels as real and as visible as the health implications of this pandemic. And obviously, it's a big economic shock that's impacted economies that were already struggling. So policymaking here is focusing on building back better at the moment, building back stronger, building back greener. These are all, I love a good alliteration and acronyms, they're all great. They're great ministerial statements, but what do we actually mean by it? And what do we mean by it for governments trying to make policy, business trying to operate across the continent when it comes to digital trade and to services trade? And I think in the pandemic and post-pandemic world, it becomes even more vital that no one is left behind by the digital agenda, and particularly the underserviced communities and vulnerable groups. And so for that reason, the UK government has been really focusing on promoting across Africa an inclusive, transformative and responsible adoption of digital policies to reduce poverty, stimulate economic growth and promote resilience. And in terms of policy areas that you asked about, there's sort of 5 key ones that we're really focusing in on. And first of which is just the digitalization of public services. That agenda here is so front and foremost in a way that in a lot of developed countries, we just take it for granted. And actually, how do we, for example, not have to go to multiple ministries and fill in lots of different forms to set up a business, or as I'm personally experienced, try and get a driving license, and actually just trying to be able to operate quicker and more efficiently for business. That digitalization agenda is really critical, and it's hugely beneficial to being part of the inclusive digital debate and growth. And we've seen some really brilliant examples about how COVID and the response to the pandemic has actually sped up that process. And we've seen in North Africa, for example, lots of trucks that used to have to get out, get their paperwork done, signed, stamped, now all going digital. And there's some really positive things that hopefully will stay as part of that process. Obviously, the second is the need to open up markets, increase competition and improve infrastructure. Telecoms provision is obviously critical for any business and anyone thinking about setting up and working across Africa. And anyone that works with South Africa at the moment knows about the load shedding issues they're facing as supply falls behind demand. And my team works in 23 different countries across Africa, and the virtual working that we've been able to do has been brilliant, but it is constantly marred by internet troubles and telecom issues. And ICT infrastructure is a key enabler of other digital services. So you take tourism, which is massive here, and you realize just how much is done now online, from comparing which hotel to go to on TripAdvisor to booking a flight. So the infrastructure and affordability of digital payment systems is really important for inclusion across Africa in this debate. And we're following with interest some really cool, interesting things that are going on. So Ethiopia, for example, has chosen to open up its telecoms market and to increase competition. And obviously, by doing that and some other reforms, they've restarted their WTO accession process, which we think is a really interesting kind of link between domestic policy and then what they're doing in Geneva. Improving the regulatory environment is where the UK government's put a lot of our focus recently, and we are very focused on the enhancement of policy, legal, regulatory frameworks. And particularly through our digital access programme, we're providing technical assistance and capability building for telecom regulators, from regulation, licensing, spectrum allocation, and essentially fundamental elements of expanding sustainable and affordable connectivity. And as part of regulation, breaking down some of those silos is going to be really important. And I have to say, we spend quite a lot of our time talking to one ministry and one government in Africa who will say, right, our digital policy is this, and we're doing some really cool, innovative stuff. And you're like, great. And then you talk to their Geneva team on their trade policy agenda, and it's a completely different policy position. So how we can actually put more experts into the right ministries and join up those ministries so that they're having a kind of a consistent policy position will be really important. And I obviously can't sit in Nairobi and not talk about successes and where actually the digital agenda in Africa is leapfrogging different stages in development. Obviously, M-Pesa here and the mobile money app, well, it is the main source of payment across the country, and it's a really exciting innovation. We've also seen massive uptakes in e-learning and e-health provision across Africa in response to COVID-19. And so in many ways, Africa is really digitalized, and how do we help to actually recognize those successes, learn from them and build on them is going to be really important. So those are some of the policy issues. Just with sort of a couple of minutes very quickly, I just wanted to pause on actually what are we as the UK government doing and where are we focusing our efforts. So one of the key elements for us is really about promoting dialogue amongst international donors, multilateral, bilateral stakeholders, and particularly promoting the adoption of the principles for digital development, and that these principles ensure that the adoption of digital technologies and solutions are genuinely user-centered, fit for purpose, context-specific, designed to encourage wide participation in digitally enabled sectors, and help to essentially create sustainable employment and jobs, which is really important. The UK is also a founding member of the Digital Impact Alliance, DIAL, like the name, DIAL. DIAL is a multi-donor initiative, and it really focuses on the fact that actually a lot of these problems can't be solved by a government or by a particular stakeholder or business or individual, and how do we bring the whole kind of digital ecosystem of donors, NGOs, development stakeholders, industries together to tackle these really big problems that are facing us. And then we've got some really brilliant programs that are very much focused on the digital agenda. So She Trades is a Commonwealth program that the UK runs, which is supporting women-owned businesses in different service sectors in Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria. And one of the things that we've particularly done is help them to go online in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, building their e-commerce platforms and digital sales and to market their goods and services online. And through the Trade and Investment Advocacy Fund, the UK is supporting developing and least developing members to actually engage with the JSI negotiations on e-commerce in the WTO. We've recently done projects with Senegal and Mauritius to help them define their negotiating positions and actually look at their regulatory framework domestically and their policy frameworks to see how they can take that forward. And obviously, again, in COVID-19, we've just been doing the little stuff like helping to make sure that the software provision is there, such as Zoom subscriptions and training, so that negotiations can happen online and they can actively participate in those negotiations. And then finally, just back to the digital access program that I mentioned, alongside doing some regulatory work, it also looks at how to catalyse inclusive, affordable, safe and secure digital access for underserved communities in Nigeria, Kenya and South Africa. They're really focusing on how to help bring that group into the digitalisation of different provisions, which is going to be really exciting. Hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of what we're up to in Africa and how I think there is a really clear join across between actually helping these countries to recognise what success they've had and to engage in debates in Geneva in an even more active way, and that's one of the things we're really focused on. Thank you.
Jane, I think you're on mute.
Asia Pacific, as I am in the APEC region, I see some similarities. I mean, a clear need for a focus on digital infrastructure and on digital skills and literacy, but also the importance, Rebecca, that you have focused on of getting the regulatory framework right and providing the technical assistance and capacity building around regulatory agendas. Yes, you know, this word regulation has now come up across both the last two speakers, and it, you know, in a sense, both Sally and Rebecca, you've used the word regulation to imply both an enabling instrument, but also a constraining one. And Sally was pretty explicit about the costs of compliance and the, you know, overly onerous, clearly not best practice regulations that just can be problematic completely for companies trying to do trade. So I think that, Sabina, what I want to ask you is to pick up on this theme of regulation and and perhaps address what are the barriers to digitally enabled services. I mean, are they all behind the border in regulations? If so, which kinds? I mean, Sally mentioned data localization. So really a general question to you, but what are the barriers that your members are seeing, and how would you go about addressing them?
Thanks, Jane. Indeed, like what I'm going to say now kind of resonates with what Sally has said, what Rebecca has touched upon. Ultimately, does come down to how do we get the rules right. And I think, you know, in terms of barriers, we are clearly struggling with a lack of globally agreed definitions to start with. What is digital trade? You know, digital trade is basically what we're doing now. The fact that we are calling in on a tech platform from various sides of the world and holding this webinar. Digital trade is, you know, kind of going online and buying a streaming service. But digital trade is also buying a book online that's delivered to you. So that's when it gets kind of confusing of what's the role of technology in digital trade. Is there any other kind of trade as tech kind of takes over a lot of the means of doing trade? So, you know, I think the definition is clearly a barrier. The lack of global baseline rules, of course, is also a barrier. And, you know, obviously the WTO has seen that, and there is an ongoing negotiation currently in Geneva to sort that problem out. How successful that will be, of course, depends on a number of factors and on the variation of just approaches to regulation and data among the members that are currently negotiating. Then we've seen kind of the threats to the moratorium on electronic duties on custom duties on electronic transmissions over the years, which is a major success of the WTO, and, you know, has allowed the digital economy to grow. And we are still, you know, kind of prolonging it, but not yet making it permanent, which I think would be a kind of making a success on a permanent basis, basically. And then we are seeing various approaches to domestic regulation, which is really problematic when it comes to digital technologies. They're developing so fast, even faster over the last 6 months. And as countries are kind of struggling with questions of how to regulate technology, doing so on separate tracks is a real problem. And as you know, I think Sally mentioned, and everyone here will know, there are fundamentally kind of different philosophical approaches to data flows among some of the countries in the WTO. And you know, if you only take, you know, the US, China, and the EU, and even putting two together, and that's proving difficult to find a framework where data flows can happen in between 2 out of 3 countries, let alone 80 plus. Then we are seeing a variation in levels of understanding of tech developments among countries. This is something Rebecca touched upon. So there is a clear element of capacity building in kind of development programs that developing countries are putting together. And kind of across the world, there is a severe shortage of digital skills. And that kind of goes for government services, but also a population at large, and how are education systems adapting or not to the development of tech. So the consequence of all these kind of barriers is that we've seen a kind of an increased protectionism. This manifests itself in various ways, right? You have web censorship, restrictions on data flows, and Sally talked about data localization. We are seeing that kind of growing around the world. Tariffs, conditions for market access, so forced transfer of IP, for instance, but also digital services taxes. I mean, you know, we all know that the kind of digital economy raises legitimate concerns about how we tax multinationals operating in multiple jurisdictions. But the national initiatives on this have kind of clearly cut across the efforts of the OECD to find a solution. So there are multiple elements that kind of contribute to this protectionist nature of the conversation. And of course, with the rise in popularity of data localization and the whole arguments that somehow that increases security and privacy and other things, I think there's probably a legitimate question why people think this is bad. And it's bad because it leads to the fragmentation of the global digital economy and the balkanization of isolated country-specific webs. It increases costs for goods and services. There is a very good study by SIPE, which I think everyone cites whenever we talk about data localization, that quantifies kind of the losses by data localization policies on GDP, on domestic investment, on competitiveness and welfare. And it's basically bad across the spectrum. Protectionism is just not a winning strategy, and especially as we are looking to kind of grow and recover from this pandemic, open markets and the free flow of data will be key. So then how do we address this situation we found ourselves in? We've done quite a lot of work over this past year, and it's a kind of ongoing work in the UK for the last 4 years of defining what an independent trade policy would look like for the UK at the end of this transition period, so starting January next year. And we've kind of identified some key principles of what just makes sensible digital trade. None of them will be surprising based on the conversation we've had so far. So, elements such as cross-border data flows, provisions against data localization, making the moratorium permanent, as I mentioned earlier, preventing the mandatory transfer of source code, algorithms, and encryption keys in exchange for market access, really important for the tech sector in everywhere, really. Opening up government data, for instance, for AI applications, that's an interesting new field of what digital trade can actually do to support the digital economy. And then kind of cooperation on regulation, something that has been touched upon a number of times and surely will come up in the conversation afterwards, is like, how do we actually talk to each other while we are developing rules for technology moving forward, and why that's important. And then it's important to note also that kind of tech provides the platform, the means for trade facilitation. So everything to do with the recognition of the signatures and the expansion of paperless trading, all these are just sensible measures to kind of enhance and promote digital trade. But then I think the ultimate question here is also, where do we address this? Right. So obviously there are multiple negotiations happening at a multilateral level. WTO, OECD. There's been under the leadership of Japan quite a lot of work on this done at G20 level, and those are really important for the kind of breadth of membership and participation. And you've got regional agreements such as CPTPP and USMCA that have some of the best provisions on digital trade that we've seen, let's say, before January this year. Because this year we also had the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and another agreement that Australia signed with Singapore, looking specifically at the digital economy. And this have much better provisions on digital inclusions, for instance, or digital ID. So they go even further than what we've seen so far in other agreements. So these are kind of like-minded nations, regardless of geography, that kind of get together and put together agreements that have very strong digital trade provisions. And then, of course, there's the bilateral element. And we are in the middle of it in the UK, as the UK is currently negotiating with both the EU, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and also looking to join CPTPP. So we think there is a really important kind of role for the UK to play in there in kind of advancing the agenda of digital trade and cooperation on all these issues. And definitely excited to see how this develops into, well, got another month until we find out at least what's going on with the EU, but also how they develop post-Brexit, so into the new year. I'll stop here because I've realized I'm dropping kind of a lot of names and information here. But yeah, happy to kind of discuss further some of these issues in the conversation. Over to you, Jay. think you're on mute, Jane.
I shouldn't be muted now. Can you hear me? Well, I found it very interesting, Sabine, your focus on the need for a definition on digital trade and your focus on it having to cover everything that is ordered online, but also everything that is delivered online. And very definitely has to also include traffic and data, which is underpinning all the digitally enabled services delivery. So a lot more for us probably to discuss in an inclusive way with the audience around that. I also wanted to just pick up your points on the increase in protectionism and the fragmentation of the market, which we certainly see also in Asia Pacific. And I think it is heartening that at the same time we see innovations at bilateral and regional level that are heading in the other direction and trying to build back towards a more cooperative regulatory environment. I just wanted, before we start our Q&A session, I know that Rebecca is not able to stay with us for the full session. And I just wanted to give Rebecca another opportunity to come in if she wanted to on any of the issues that Sabina had talked about. One of them perhaps is this notion that SMEs and micro SMEs in particular are really the ones that are hurt most by onerous compliance costs in regulation. And yet in the digital world, we're seeing real growth in born digital, born global firms. Are you seeing this in Africa too?
Thank you, Jane. And yes, sorry, everyone. Unfortunately, I have to disappear on the hour. So apologies. I'm really sad to miss the rest of this discussion because I have to say it's really lovely to dive back in quite this much detail to an area I used to spend a lot of my time on. I completely agree, Jane, on SMEs and micro SMEs. And also, I think we've had some questions in the chat box around sort of gender, and obviously particularly a lot of SMEs in Africa are women-led, and we do a lot of work with female entrepreneurs and really looking at exactly as you said, how do we take them international immediately. And there's a brilliant organization called the Lionesses of Africa, which is all about actually supporting female entrepreneurs, making sure that they are immediately international companies and actually promoting opportunities for them and linking them up with British companies and British sponsors and leading experts in their areas to really help give them that sort of support. We definitely do see that there is a disproportionate impact of regulation on small businesses. I think one of the interesting things we do see in Africa is there's sort of a threshold. And if you can stay below, quite a lot of the policies here are designed, obviously, as I said at the beginning, varies massively by market, but quite a lot of policies we see coming out, particularly when they have been thought of for a digital tech space, have a sort of threshold in terms of how much they're making. And we see a lot of companies that actually choose to purposely try and stay below that because the regulatory burden that then hits them after they go above that. And so it's a massive disincentive for companies to grow. And I think one of the things that we are keen to work with different African governments on is how do we get that balance right between enabling policies that help support small businesses and medium-sized businesses, but also enable and encourage those businesses to continue to develop through the different stages, rather than having a set of policies that encourages you to sort of stay slightly below those thresholds.
Thank you, Rebecca. I have found this discussion so far very heartening. I mean, we have on this panel 3 women who are really rolling up their sleeves and throwing themselves into trade and services with a high degree of passion, which I'm delighted to see. And just before I hand over to Sally, I just want to say that 91% of women in the workforce in Australia work in the services sector. So there is no question about it, even in an economy like mine, that this is the growth area for women. But I think it's one thing that I wanted to say in response really to Sally. I think in the United Kingdom, I think you take trade and services almost for granted. After all, the UK, it's a highly innovative economy, and it is one of the world's most services oriented. I mean, if we measure it in value added terms, services are 67% of your total exports. That is second only to Hong Kong, China, and Singapore, and way ahead of the United States. And I think we forget that often about the United Kingdom, that your economy is so much in the services sector that you probably take for granted a lot of what some of us in the rest of the world are really just coming to grapple with. So I've enjoyed very much moderating this session. It's approaching midnight in Australia. And so at midnight, I hand over to Sally, who will moderate the interaction with the audience. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much, Jane. I really appreciate that. And just as you did, I'm going to start by covering the questions in the chat function, because those are the ones that the audience have asked, and therefore I want to make sure that we get to those. So Jane, I am actually going to start with you because it doesn't seem fair to ask you difficult questions after midnight your time. But the first question that comes along is, effectively, when referring to regulatory corporations, can we still have faith in a multilateral system to forge progress? Or do we need to look to national governments or possibly bilateral regulator to regulator interactions to move things forward? Jane, I'm going to start with you for an answer to that one, and then I'm going to pick on Rebecca and squeeze every last drop of knowledge out of her while she's here to see if Africa has any specific thoughts on that.
It's a big question, but I'm an optimist on the regulatory cooperation front. The key to regulatory cooperation is obviously building confidence in each other's systems, and that starts by people talking to each other. Unfortunately, the WTO has not been in the past particularly set up for discussion even around regulation. The regulator and the trade negotiator seem to be two essentially different people, whereas bilaterally and at regional level, it's been very much easier, including on privacy, for example. But I think that what's going on bilaterally and regionally can build back to Geneva and must build back to Geneva. I don't think we should give up on the absolute. It's crystal clear that there is sequencing involved here. We're not going to see trade liberalisation at the border until behind the border our regulators are learning how to interoperate. And so I really feel very strongly that we don't give up on Geneva on this. On the contrary, we have to keep bringing the regulators and the trade negotiators back together. And the best way for this to happen is for the services industry stakeholders to keep advocating for regulatory cooperation.
Thank you, Jane. Rebecca, does that tie in with what you're seeing in Africa?
Thank you, Sally. Yes, it does. I think the one thing I would probably add to that is that obviously the big trade policy issue at the moment across Africa is the African Continental Free Trade Area and the opportunity that that presents. And I think it's really interesting going with the WTO is that a lot of the debate, for example, around data flows, that is a debate here in Africa, but it's just not as heated as it is in the EU or across with the US or Australia and New Zealand. And it's not their kind of number one top of their list concern when they're thinking about digital trade. So they often say to me, yes, but those are the rules made either in the kind of Asia Pacific and CPTPP, or they're made by the big developing countries in big FTAs. What about rules for us? And then there's a whole nother chunk of it, which is about trust for them. And actually just sort of a lot of countries we're seeing in Geneva, African countries joining in terms of sitting and watching what's going on in the JSI and e-commerce, but not actually actively participating in it. And so the interest is there, but they're very worried that the rules are essentially made by developed countries for developed countries. And I think what's really interesting about the AFCFTA is it presents an opportunity to actually see rules being developed for African countries in a context and an environment that is safe to have a discussion, to test things out, to actually explore in more detail. And I think, I'm sure it will tread a lot of common ground. I'm sure a lot of the concepts that we will see in that debate once the discussions get there will be around very similar topics, but actually that will give a different space and a different take on those similar topics. And I also think that wouldn't it be brilliant if they actually came up with some new stuff as well and started to think a bit differently. And then maybe just one point on regulator cooperation. I think alongside cooperation and join up, I think there's also a lessons learned thing and sharing information and sharing best practice. So one of the main things that we actually get approached from African governments here to talk about is the UK's better regulation policy and how we've done the kind of one in, one out policy, and how policy making in the UK does take business impact into account. And we do those sorts of tests. And exactly as Jane says, I think in the UK, we take that for granted, that you can't possibly do a piece of policy without testing its impact on business or on trade. And you come here and it's a very different scenario. And actually sort of alongside increasing cooperation, I think there is increasing learning on both sides and actually understanding on both sides so that we can learn from each other.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer. Rebecca, I'm now going to not ask you any more questions, given that you need to drop off. So thank you so much for being part of our panel. It's been a pleasure to have you. Please do stick around
me.
for as long as you can, but you won't have to worry about taking any more questions. So that, on the other hand, puts Sabina and Jane very much on the hook. Aha, you thought you got away with it, but no. Sabina, I'm going to turn to you next. Because we've had several questions come in that have a flavour of GDPR about them. And as our Brussels representative, it feels only fair that they come to you. So I'm going to pick up the first one, which is specifically about transatlantic data flows, and whether, I assume this is a reference to the Schrems II decision, whether there's still any hope for transatlantic regulatory cooperation in respect of data flows.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks to who put that question. I worked for 5 years of my life on GDPR. Don't blame me for it. But after 5 years, I thought I'm done. And here it is, following me for the rest of my life. So just to pick on kind of a broad point first, which is we need high levels of data protection to basically have their crucial for the trust in the technology and the trust in trade. Without that, it's kind of hard to see how we can achieve data flows in trade agreements and not kind of fuel the protectionist arguments around kind of keeping data at home. So, just a very broad point there. On the privacy shield specifically, so I think one of the things that's often misunderstood is that somehow the European Commission wants this whole, privacy shield to fall. And that, there is some sort, the competition exists in between the systems, right? The harmonization system of the EU, so based on adequacy decisions, and the interoperability system that a lot of other countries around the world are adopting. But in terms of privacy shield, there is a broad number of stakeholders that want this to succeed. So, obviously the usual suspects are the US government, US industry, the EU industry, and then, you've got the European Commission on board as well. So it's a broad number of stakeholders that want to see this agreement succeed. And that's why we kind of have a renegotiation, after the safe harbor and the privacy shield, we now have a renegotiation for Privacy Shield 2.0 to address some of the issues that were raised in the European Court of Justice ruling. How successful will that be? Difficult to say. Difficult to say that whether any kind of mechanism that they come up with can withstand another court ruling. So it's hard to say at this stage, but I think the broader question here is whether the ECJ ruling has an impact on adequacy itself, on the whole mechanism that the EU employs to assess whether a country, where you can transfer data to a specific country, because this is the new standard. The 16th of July ruling kind of sets a new standard for how basically national security agencies access data. can any country withstand that that standard? It's hard to say, and there are a number of adequacy decisions up for review kind of pretty soon that may suffer the same fate. And if we are being very honest, I'm not sure that a lot of European member states can withstand that test themselves. So it's a broader question of how the EU does its kind of data transfer system, and how much of an impact will the ECJ ruling have on the broader questions around this. This is also important for the UK, of course, because we are awaiting an adequacy decision from the European Commission on whether the data can travel freely after the end of the year. And what that will mean is very important, because even if there is a positive adequacy decision, it will come with strings attached. It will kind of tie up the UK to the EU system and potentially kind of prevent it from doing cross-border data flows in a straight agreement with the US and Australia, for instance. We don't have a positive adequacy decision from the European Commission. So there are like a number of questions coming out of the 16th of July ruling that I think will follow us for many months ahead. And I think another point to make is that there's also a US election coming up, and there has been a conversation going on for years on whether the US should have a federal data protection law. Depending on that election result, we may or may not have that attempt for creating this new US federal data protection law, and that again will have an impact for how kind of the Western world altogether sees data flows. So a lot of moving pieces. I'm not sure I've actually answered your question or that anyone has an answer at this stage, but I think for any kind of broader agreement to happen, something's got to give. Whether it's in the EU system, in the US system, but in the way we approach data transfer, something will have to change for us to be able to reach that baseline agreement on data flows.
Thank you, Sabina. So we do have another GDPR question that's come in, so just get yourself ready for that one. But it's also got some interesting angles for Jane, because it looks at the regulatory controls domestically across the south of the globe, and whether the global south is stealing from or mimicking GDPR provisions in its own domestic regulation. So I think, Jane, if we can start with you on, do you think that the global south's regulatory framework is based on GDPR? And then afterwards, I'll turn to Sabina for views on whether that's an effective way to ensure regulators are at least singing from the same hymn book. But Jane first.
Thank you. I'm not sure that I know what the global south is. I mean, I am sitting here in Sydney, which is about as south as we can get tonight. But, and nor am I sure that it's privacy that is the key thrust behind what we are seeing in terms of fragmentation of digital trade. I'm not sure that privacy is always the key thing. We see just as much going on for national security reasons. We see cybersecurity regulations. We see all sorts of consumer protection regulations. Privacy is one of a whole string, and my feeling is not so much that mimicking of GDPR is going on. I think when it comes to privacy, we're either seeing the kind of approach which the OECD has recommended and that APEC has been following, which is a more voluntary-based, principles-based, mutual recognition of each other's privacy regulations. Or what we're seeing is and really, I mean, the purpose is really data localization. It's not for privacy reasons. It's much more for what I'd call digital industrial policy reasons. So I'm not sure that what GDPR has done, however, has shown the world that a unilateral standard extraterritorially imposed on everybody else is a big, powerful instrument. And many other countries might like to be able to mimic that approach. I doubt there are many that actually have the power to do so. But what I see is not mimicking of GDPR. What I see is more what I would call industrial policy protectionist approaches.
Sabina, I saw you nodding along there. Would that be something you
I'm
agree with?
definitely nodding along here. I think oftentimes privacy is used as a kind of excuse, if you want, as is security. Both of them are used as the justification for what ultimately are exactly that, like digital industrial policy. I love the name of that, but what ultimately are protectionist economic measures. So I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely what it is and what we've seen kind of coming up. But it's true that, you know, some of the regulations we've seen in the privacy space offer that umbrella and offer that umbrella excuse for, you know, kind of basically taking measures that are protectionist and claiming they're somehow protecting citizens' privacy and security. And I think what's really worrying is you know, kind of seeing that coming up in the EU right now. For the longest time, advocates of the free flow of data, of course, with the brackets around the personal data and GDPR, but kind of seeing calls for data localization by EU-based regulators is pretty striking, and I think it's the signal of the times we live in and the kind of direction that, you know, some of the advocates for the free flow of data internationally are taking nowadays. I think, you know, measures such as, you know, in the US, right, banning of a specific social media platform, same kind of trends of, you know, kind of not really walking the talk domestically, that doesn't really meet what you're kind of saying internationally. And I think that is a problem of credibility for a lot of us here.
Thank you. So questions are still coming in to the question and answer function thick and fast. Jane, I'm going to come back to that gender bias question that Rebecca started to pick up earlier with the lovely lionesses of Africa. So the question is specifically, how can gender and other biases be countered through the use of digital and artificial intelligence? And Sabina, before you relax, if you've got a PhD in artificial intelligence, it is coming back to you, my friend, when Jane is done. Just telling you that.
My comment is quite a brief one, but look, when I see the word bias, to me, the solutions to bias lie in frameworks of ethics. And what ethics is not my field, nor is AI. So I have to go back to sort of first principles here and ask myself, ethics of AI, there are a lot of people out there working on this. Is this a trade issue? And in digital trade, we ask ourselves that question a great deal. To what extent is cybersecurity a trade issue? To what extent is privacy a trade issue? To what extent is the ethics of AI a trade issue? And Sabina mentioned the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement. And just looking at that agreement and all the various bits and pieces attached to it, which are effectively the agenda for ongoing and future work, I think it's very interesting to see that one of those areas of ongoing work between Australia and Singapore will precisely be to try and cooperate in designing some jointly accepted framework for ethics of AI. Now, why is that a sensible thing to do? Because ultimately there will have to be an international standard on the ethics for AI, and much better that the standard not be one that is nationally dreamt up and nationally imposed, but actually thought through with trading partners from scratch. So I guess really I just want to say that this is precisely the kind of area where regulators need to get together right at ground zero before we have our frameworks in place nationally even, and think together about what should the standards be here, because there is no doubt that there are multiple kinds of biases that might be built into applications of AI, which would cause all of us problems from a trade perspective.
Sabina, as our newly identified AI expert.
I'm not getting away with it, am I?
No.
So I think it is a matter of, I very much agree with Jane that it has to be a matter of international cooperation. We have to have these conversations going. Of course, we know in Europe that regulatory cooperation is a very radioactive term, as it often implies somehow some kind of compromise on sovereignty, and that usually that's what brought down the TTIP, among others. If you're following that negotiation at that point, the idea that you somehow give up some of your power to regulate, which is obviously not the case, right? What we do in regulatory cooperation when it comes to trade agreements is to actually put on the table what we're thinking of. What are the kind of areas we're thinking of regulated? Are there any other good ideas out there? Anything we can cooperate on? Which is, of course, when you translate that into what it actually is, it's actually a very good idea, especially around emerging technology. So AI is one of them, but there's like a million other areas of emerging technology regulation that should bring countries together as they think about what to do in terms of a domestic regulatory framework. And on specifically on AI, so we've seen the global partnership on artificial intelligence that kind of sits within the OECD now. Even last Friday, actually, so 2 days ago, there was an announcement by the US and the UK on cooperation on AI research and development. Of course, we don't have yet the actual detail on that and what it means and what it focuses on. But I think it's important to kind of outline that it does come down to ethics and transparency of algorithms, and how you tackle that domestically, but also how you cooperate internationally, especially when some of these companies operate across multiple jurisdictions. So I think it does come down to kind of understanding the technology, understanding what you're putting rules in place for, making them proportionate and targeted, and kind of making sure that every stakeholder that should be involved in, including international trading partners, are in the room when you're kind of trying to figure out the answers to these questions that everyone is grappling with. The idea that it's only the UK or only the US or only the EU that are kind of they're all looking at the same issues in the same time, and I think kind of doing that together is very important for the way these technologies are going to develop.
Thank you. So I'm going to have a stab at answering a question myself. This is a bold thing for a moderator to do. So the question that's come in is, do you think possible plurilateral efforts on ICT-enabled trade will provide an impetus to multilateralism? Or on the other hand, do they risk promoting a tiered system that leaves some countries left out and thus undermines multilateralism? And I'm going to answer that from the perspective that in the context of whether multi or plurilateral efforts are making the most forward strides, I don't think ICT-enabled trade is different from other areas. I tend to be an optimist, and I tend to think that it's by smaller groups of countries creating a framework and a momentum that the multilateral efforts most often get the push they need to get over the edge. And we're seeing that at the WTO with e-commerce, and we're seeing that at the WTO with domestic regulation. And although those two areas are not moving forward as fast as some would see, they are making forward progress. And I think in part it's because of the digital services chapters that we're seeing coming out of first the TISA negotiations, albeit they didn't end up coming to fruition, and then CPTPP. So my answer to that question is, as an optimist, I believe that any efforts move trade forward, and that if the multilateral regime isn't pushing the agenda, it will catch up in due course to great ideas. Again, I welcome any views from the panelists, either in agreement or in disagreement, but I think it's such an interesting area, and it's wrong, I think, in many ways, to restrict it to digital and ICT trade.
I'll just very briefly jump in to say I agree, and I think it's very difficult to start with 190 countries around the table to reach any kind of agreement. You have to start somewhere. And I think, kind of having this regional agreements, having this digital trade chapters, having the digital economy partnership agreements that we've seen more recently, only push that conversation forward in the WTO as well. And that need for kind of broad baseline agreements on what e-commerce means and what are kind of the rules that you need to put in place. So I definitely agree that it kind of has to start somewhere, and what we've seen with the e-commerce negotiations, for instance, like more countries joining since that ministerial when they decided to kind of start. So obviously it's a bit contagious, if you want. So hopefully we'll see more countries joining, and the e-commerce negotiations kind of reaching a kind of commercially meaningful result. It's not going to be easy, that's for sure, because there are massive disagreements on some really key issues. But I think the value of it is exactly the breadth of membership and the breadth of participation. So yeah, I definitely agree that it kind of leads all the developments we've seen in digital trade lead to kind of the urgency to get an agreement at WTO.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we have 20 minutes remaining, and I'm also conscious that we promised the Geneva Trade Week organisers that we would ask a discussion question to which the audience could participate, presumably via the chat function. So I do feel that I must now move on to that. Now the discussion question is, what needs to be in place to create a holistic trade policy approach that spans goods, services and digital? We're seeing convergence of those three naturally, in a sense, in that that's how businesses are starting to trade, with services and goods and digital all intertwining. I have clients now in the goods space who give their goods away for free because they make the money servicing the goods in aftercare and after sales. I'm seeing my services clients increasingly operate digitally across the globe, and I'm seeing digital emerge as a new service. I'm using that phrase advisedly, because it's seen as a different thing altogether rather than necessarily an a new way of doing old business. So we seem to find ourselves in an era of great change, where the fourth industrial revolution is pushing us forward without necessarily trade frameworks keeping pace. So to kick us off on this thought process, Sabina, what is needed for a global baseline agreement, and what do we do to put that in place?
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, so I think fundamentally to the broader question, fundamental is, how do we get data flows right? Because we can have all the digital trade chapters we want and all the digital trade negotiations we want. There are very important elements in those digital trade chapters. But fundamentally, it comes down to, do we actually have data flows in between the countries that sign trade agreements? And data flows are kind of the backbone of the digital economy. We've heard that time and again, and coming under increasing kind of protectionist pressure, as we've seen with data localization measures, and
in digital, in part because it is such a fast-moving area that good changes from 1 year to the next, sometimes from 1 month to the next. I don't know if that's something you've ever had a chance to give any thought to Jane or Sabina, as to what a good outcome might be defined as, or might look like in this context. Now, may well be not something that you've given much thought to, but if you have any thoughts, I think it'd be interesting to hear from you now. Jane, I think you're still on mute. There we go.
Sally, I'm happy to come in here, but I have been reflecting on some of the questions sitting there in the Q&A from the audience, and I wonder if I can just they're related to the comments you've made, but slightly different. There is one question there which asks about mode 1 and whether we can think about mode 1 services trade as being digital trade. And very largely, of course, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. It's just that there are other modes also of services trade which are digitalizing. In fact, what we've learned is that most services can be delivered in all 4 modes. And those that weren't originally digitally delivered are learning how to become digitally delivered. So we are seeing a big shift there. But the point I want to make in response to that question is that there are fewer commitments under the gaps on mode 1 than any other mode. It is the online supply is the one mode that still has that little NA in the schedule saying not applicable, because we couldn't even imagine the internet when the schedule was written. And where we do have a commitment, it's often of that nature. And then we just don't have very many. So there is very little discipline at the moment in that online supply mode, and therein lies a big part of the problem, because we know that even if the GATS and GATS principles certainly do apply, including to cross-border data flows, we're not getting the commitments, the bound commitments, which are what is needed to deliver predictability for business. And there is another question there that I wanted to quickly approach, Sally, if I may, and that is about the moratorium, because we haven't talked about the WTO moratorium on electronic transactions. But Sabina did talk about digital services taxes. And I think part of the problem with the moratorium is that even countries that are very aware of the benefits of digitalisation and want to move into the digital age also have a different objective. It's a revenue-raising objective, which is worrying them. And there is a need for work to be undertaken to show that tariffs are not neither practical nor efficient ways of raising revenue in a digital world. I'd like to see the G20 do that study, because I think it is really necessary. I mean, we have to move to non-discriminatory taxation arrangements, value-added or sales taxes, and not tariffs in this arena. But I think there is a big agenda out there which industry hasn't focused on so much, but it is time for governments themselves to do that work and to show that tariffs is not the way to go. Then we might succeed in having the moratorium made permanent.
I certainly couldn't agree with you any stronger than when it says that tariffs aren't the way forward. It's such a backward-facing, non-progressive tax. It's harder to imagine or design off the top of my head. So coming back to the question of whether and to what extent we have the tools in place to create a holistic trade policy approach. I would like to invite anybody who wishes to make a point to put it into the chat function now, or the Q&A function. Either is fine, and then we can open the discussion to the floor. But in the meantime, while we're waiting to see if anybody from the audience has any points to make about global baseline agreements or holistic trade policy approaches to digital trade, there was another question that I thought was interesting in the chat function that I thought I would take an initial stab at before we come any further. And again, it's not so much specific to digital trade as more generally. Can the WTO be counted on now to come to binding agreements? And I mean, that is probably the $64,000 question in trade at present. Again, I am something of an optimist. I tend to think that although the WTO may need to change or update itself, recognizing that some of the complaints made from some quarters have validity to them, I don't think the WTO is dead, and I do believe that it will resurrect and grow from its bases, from the base now. And I think that's true whether it comes to digital trade or anything else. Sabina, what are your thoughts there?
I want to share the optimism. I really want to share the optimism. I think, I definitely think there is a future for the WTO. I think it's a troubled present, and it's been a troubled recent past. And I don't think that's going away. There is obviously a question of what happens in November in the US as well that will define how or how WTO operates or doesn't over the next few years. But I definitely think that when it comes to digital trade, that's the place to attempt to reduce the current brackets that exist in this e-commerce negotiation stock take document that we've seen in August. And I think a lot of the countries, a lot of the kind of Western countries, if you want, that are part of this negotiation are part of this negotiation specifically because, you kind of have such a broad membership and you have China on board, right? Most of them would have agreements in between them. Most of them would be kind of part of various regional bilateral agreements with strong digital trade provisions. The reason why everyone is kind of putting an effort into this negotiation is specifically because you kind of have China and a lot of other players in there that disagree on one or two or three of the kind of key points of digital trade. And whether you think of data flows, the moratorium, kind of regulatory cooperation, but also kind of transfer of IP kind of significantly here. And I think that's an important point to make for just how much effort countries are willing to put and why WTO may be the place for this kind of baseline agreement if we're ever going to achieve a baseline agreement for digital trade.
Wonderful. I'm very conscious that we're into the final 3 minutes of our session. Jane, do you have any last reflections that you'd like to make?
Well, I think that the makings of a baseline agreement are there in the JSI on e-commerce. I think the critical thing is for countries to join it. It will cease to be plurilateral the moment everyone makes that decision to join it. At the moment, if not participating, then observing it to me, it doesn't make sense to not be sitting there finding out what's going on. What are the ingredients? They're everything that we have been talking around trust issues, whether it's privacy or cybersecurity. There is an element that is trade related and must be in the baseline agreement. There must be something on cross-border data flows. It must be clear that traffic in data is understood to be part of digital trade. So we're going to need some statement on freedom of cross-border data flow. We're going to have something on the moratorium that works towards it becoming permanent. I think that we need something on domestic regulation. We've talked a lot about regulation. There has to be some agreement around the principles that should govern regulation in this area. And I think that we need, I could call them trade facilitation elements. We have to be agreeing on mutual recognition of e-invoicing, e-payments, e-identities. These are critically important issues to enable business to connect. So at the end of the day, this baseline agreement has got to be something that actually enables business to happen. At the moment, there are so many blockages in the way. And we face this reality that trade in services is on a stronger upward growth path than trade in goods, which has been stagnating. It's been in long-term stagnation for some time. And we know that within trade in services, the shift to digital will continue. So this baseline agreement isn't just a hypothesis. We have to have it. And ultimately, because in this panel, we are business stakeholders, all of us, we know that there needs to be some market access. So maybe not much, but there has to be some market access around the services that are critical to the provision of e-commerce as a minimum. That's my response on what do we need for connectivity.
And that's a fantastic note on which to end. Jane, Sabina, Rebecca in absence, thank you so much for participating. Thanks to Geneva Trade Week for having us. And I'd like to wish every single member of our audience a very pleasant rest of conference. Thank you.